I spent the past week researching gear, techniques, events, and culture to answer the question, why does the 60s sound like that? And how it all relates to rebellion, psychedelics, and
LSD and some other things, narcotic.
The 60s is one of the most iconic decades when it comes to music. It's a decade full of innovation and I think a lot of genre bending and overall freedom in terms of music. I believe the music from a particular decade is a clear reflection of society and culture of the time. Looking back at these decades can teach us a lot about music innovation and music history, but also a lot about ourselves. So starting off here, let's talk about some innovations from the 60s. Let's talk about fuzz. In 1960, Marty Robbins was in a Nashville recording session when one of the transformers in the recording console they were using blew, giving bassist Grady Martin a distinct overdriven fuzzy buzzy sound on his bass. This was a recording session for the song Don't Worry. An engineer on the project, Glenn Snoddy, was intrigued by this unique sound, so he set out to try to recreate it by disabling one of the circuits in the board of his console. He tinkered with the solid-state circuits, trying to give that same buzzy sound that he was so inspired by. In 1962, he sold this circuit design to Gibson, who began developing and selling what is known as the first commercially available effects pedal, the Maestro FZ1 fuzz tone. Then 3 years later, Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards would be toying with this while on his US tour, eventually coming up with the famous guitar riff on I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Now, I'm going to take a brief moment to mention the sponsor of this video. It's me. I've spent the last couple of weeks working on something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I am launching a clothing brand called Lyre and Loom. It's kind of like merch for this channel, but I do want it to be a standalone, nice, high-quality clothing brand. So that's why you'll see a lot of clothing that has to do with music and audio gear, especially vintage. But also there's the Essentials collection that is just normal hoodies, shirts, and high-quality apparel. And my favorite thing about it is I'm working with artists to develop special collections for you guys. Like right now we have a holiday collection up. And the thing is, whenever I work with an artist, we split all the profits of the sales 50-50. The holiday collection we have up has a lot of holiday sweaters up right now, retro audio gear, puns, and basically anything you would need to keep cozy and warm for the holiday season. And it's the most direct way to support me and these videos. So I'd appreciate it that if anything, you would just at least check it out. And if you're not seeing anything that you're interested in, leave a comment and let me know what you would like to see. I want to make stuff that excites you and that helps support me and making these videos on this channel. Now, it's hard to talk about innovations in the 60s or innovations in music in general without discussing Les Paul. Many people know him from the iconic Les Paul guitar, but he did way more than just that. Multi-track recording technology was being thought up and being developed in the late 1940s, after the introduction of magnetic tape as the medium of recording. Multi-track recording was being developed by the US company Ampex through the experiments of Les Paul. In 1954, Ampex produced the first 8-trap tape machine at Les Paul's request. These tape machines were rarely seen in studios until the 60s, but this innovation is the basis for how we create music today. Ever since the late 60s, his influence has been felt in every single recording. Being able to layer instruments and experiment was the basis for bands like the Beach Boys or the Beatles. Layers and effects became the basis of their unique sound that set them apart from other bands at the time. Speaking of effects, we start seeing a wider spread usage of things like tape delay or flanging. If you started two reel-to-reel tape machines at the same time, but then the engineer presses down on the flange of one of the machines, actively slowing down one of the tape machines, you would get small micro differences in time that would cause phase issues and comb filtering. This was used in the Beatles' Revolver album. John Lennon reportedly gave the name of the effect flanging, and the first song by the Beatles to use it was Tomorrow Never Knows on the Revolver album. The 60s didn't just have innovations in terms of gear, but also mixing mindset and techniques in the actual studio. One great example of this is Phil Spector, a renowned songwriter and producer in the 60s, being known having led the girl group sound, having produced records for the Ronettes, the Crystals, Ike and Tina Turner. He's famous for the use and coining of the term the wall of sound, where he was able to use multi-track recording to layer different things like trumpets, horns, guitar, piano, vocals, along with clever use of effects to kind of meld it all into one, not one instrument, but just all one foundation in supporting the vocal and the rhythm section. This was an effort to make the records feel more full and to fill out the stereo system, making it more appealing and more attractive to people buying records. He also used this technique when producing for the Beatles. This sound and this technique of mixing instruments together is still seen to great effect today. Segueing away from the Beatles a little bit, let's go to America, and specifically Detroit. Motown being a nod to the motor town in which it was founded by Berry Gordy. He worked in Detroit on a car production line in car manufacturing. He began Motown Records on a loan of just $800, which is equivalent to around $8,600 today. It didn't take long for Motown to pick up steam, signing acts like The Miracles, The Marvelettes, eventually getting The Temptations, Jackson 5, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder. The amount of cultural impact that Motown has had still today, and just how big each of the artists that were signed are now. It's no secret that Motown was a huge part of the 60s sound and a huge part of the sound that music led into the 70s. Motown blended the sound of call and response from gospel and the syncopation and improvisation of the jazz sound. Interplay between lead singers and backup singers, tambourine, blaring horns, the iconic reverb of the Motown echo chamber. Motown wasn't trying to sound like anything else. It was very comfortable with just being its own thing. And Motown was very culturally impactful, not just in the music industry, but employing a multiracial staff when America was so divided. Gordy's vision was for music to be a great unifier. He believed that everyone should enjoy music all the same, and regardless of background, music is for everybody. Motown had its cultural impact on music, but so did the individual acts that came from Motown, going far into the 70s and 80s, and still today we see that impact, along with Abbey Road as one of the most influential and iconic studios. It wasn't just a building, it was a sound, it was a philosophy, it was an idea, it was a safe haven, it was a cultural mixing pot. Now, turning away from Motown, let's talk about psychedelic rock, a big sound of the 60s, and a big example of the music of the time reflecting society. Psychedelic rock originated from American West Coast hippie culture in the mid to late 60s, originating in San Francisco Bay Area, but it quickly spread to the rest of the United States as well as Europe. The widely accepted example of the first psychedelic rock band was the 13th Floor Elevators. Their 1966 debut album being called The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. The 60s is so synonymous with this hippie movement, and it's also a bit of rebellion and pushback from tensions that were in the country and abroad in the 60s. And the rebellion genre of the 50s wanted to get in on that. In the late 60s, rock and roll music started to incorporate psychedelic sounds in their music. The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, one of the best records of all time in my opinion. The Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesty's Request. Or also the Beatles with Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Magical Mystery Tour. And psychedelic rock was brought to England. In 1966, we had Sunshine Superman, and Cream's Disraeli Gear, and Tommy by The Who. These groups all firmly established Britain into the psychedelic scene. But of course, no discussion is finished without talking about Pink Floyd and their influence on this genre. Their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was full of groundbreaking and hypnotic acid rock that was pushing the genre forward. And the 1969 Woodstock Music Festival kind of noted the end of the psychedelic era. Not the end of the psychedelic sound, but kind of the wind down from the boom. We had big artists like Jimi Hendrix, The Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, Jefferson Airplane. The rebellious nature of this genre and its close affiliation with drugs had a lot of pushback in anti-hippie movements, which kind of contributed to the decline of the popularity of this genre. Now, a genre absolutely beloved, but in the early 70s, there was a lot of pushback, and a lot of bands transitioning away from psychedelic rock to hard or progressive rock. The 60s have had a lasting influence on modern music today. Think of groups like the Black Keys or Tame Impala, still utilizing these techniques to great effect to either make modern music that's timeless or to allude to another time, allude to the hippie movement, allude to rebellion, and just to overall change and progression. That's what the 60s kind of means to me. It's It's a decade characterized by a movement forward, a movement into the 70s away from the 50s. It was definitely a transitional period. We weren't so focused on the effects of war, and we were trying to figure out what it meant to be our individual countries. This video is very American-centric. I understand that a lot of my channel is. That's just what I know the most about and I feel most qualified to talk about. I fully understand that. I tried to include a little bit more of the UK and Europe in this. But again, that's not my expertise. In future videos, I will be making more of an effort to include other areas globally. Well guys, that's going to do it for this deep dive. Please let me know in the comments what era you'd like to see next. But that's going to do it this week. I'll see you guys next week. I hope you have an amazing Thanksgiving, and I'll see you guys in the next one.